All right. All right. Thank you guys so much for being here. My name is Abraham. I'm the Department Head of Student Success here at Pre-Health Shadowing. Thank you so much for taking some time out of your day to be here today. Um, Today, we will be starting our session with Dr. Thomas Champney. He's a professor in the Department of Cell Biology at the University of Miami Miller School of Medicine. Before we start, I'm going to share my screen to do some, just to kind of do a startup slide. Can everyone see my screen? All right, cool. So, okay, thank you guys again for being here. Okay, so we do have closed captions to accommodate students of all, abilities and needs. If you guys have any ideas about how we can be more accessible, please feel free to reach out to us. It's our honor to always be more inclusive. You can email us at info@prehealthshadowing.com. And if you guys would like to stay in the loop, make sure you join our email list. We have a lot of different social media accounts available right now: TikTok, LinkedIn, Twitter. Feel free to reach out to any of us and subscribe as well. Yeah, so thank you again for being here, you guys. I'm from Madera, California. I'd really like to see where you guys are at in the chat below. And if you guys are interested in being a part of pre-health shadowing, there's a lot of openings available. Again, we are a student-run, women-led minority nonprofit dedicated to expanding opportunities to pre-health students all over the world. This is a virtual and volunteer role. We have a couple different roles right now. And if you are a high school student, we do have our HTP program. You can actually put a request in our website, and you can even open a chapter in your own high schools. And also, since we are a nonprofit, again, if you can donate, all of the money will go toward funding more programs for you guys to make it free and accessible to everyone. And then if you guys have any questions in the chat, please feel free to drop them down. And make sure you guys just take good notes. We will have a session, this session available on YouTube. You guys can, if you guys miss a session or a section, please rewatch it, and then you could take your test to get your hours. And then ideally, cameras on. We would love to see your faces and see kind of the human behind the screen. And then I think we are ready. Doctor, did you want to share your screen?
I can. So go here. And so are we ready to go, Abraham?
We are all ready to go.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. Thank you. The title I've kind of given the talk today is Pre-Health Professional Development, or How Does One Become an Anatomist? Because that's kind of what I do for my job. Is I teach anatomy to first-year medical students. I also teach histology, embryology, and neuroanatomy to the various students. And I've had a varied career, which I'll tell you about in just a minute. But currently, I really have an interest in research ethics and ethics of human tissue use as well, which we can talk about later also. This is me here laughing quite nicely with two of my friends and colleagues. We make up the Bioethics Unicorns, and I'll show you a little bit about that as well. It's a cute little website we have that's kind of fun. So this is me. This is my email address. I'm happy to answer emails if you'd like to send them, etc. This is the University of Miami's medical school. So it's up in here, this complex. That's downtown Miami. You can see the bay and the ocean further in the distance. And the medical school's here. I'm in which building? I am in that building right there, about the 4th floor. So, but you can see it's a fairly busy area of Miami. This is me smiling very nicely because I love to sail. It's one of the reasons I'm in Miami is I do lots and lots of sailing. So, and I don't know if you noticed the South African flag. This was some friend of ours who were from South Africa, and I was sailing on their boat. So that was quite nice. Happy to chat about sailing at some time as well. As Abraham said, if you want to put questions into the chat, that's fine. Or we'll also have a Q&A kind of open answering session at the end as well, where I'm happy to answer any questions you'd like. So with that, I'm going to kind of give you a brief biography and timeline of my life. We can kind of go through, and then, of course, if you have questions about it at the end, we'll do that. So I was born in 1958 in Buffalo. So I just celebrated my 66th birthday. So I'm a pretty old dude. I was raised in Huntington on Long Island. So I moved down to Huntington when I was 3 years old, and I graduated from high school in 1976. I have the distinction of being a bicentennial high school graduate, which means that the United States celebrated its 200th year birthday, its bicentennial in 1976, and I was a high school graduate then. So my little tassel has a little bicentennial thing on it, etc. I then went to college at Southampton College on the east end of Long Island, and I graduated in 3 years in 1979 with a dual degree in biology and marine biology. At that point in time, I had kind of thought about being another Jacques Cousteau, doing research and stuff with marine biology. I did a lot of marine biological things, collected a lot of samples, did research, etc. And as I pointed out here, a little fun fact, while during the summer between my college years, I actually sold shoes at Bergdorf Goodman in New York City. That's a very well-known dress establishment for fairly rich individuals, and I got to make a lot of money selling shoes there. It's a way to help me pay my way through college. So once I graduated from Southampton College, the idea was, what am I going to do now? Should I go get a job? Should I go to graduate school? And so I saw an ad for a Master's of Arts in Teaching degree at Colgate University. And so I applied for that. I did it in 1 year. I got a 1-year degree, graduated in 1980. While I was there, I did some student teaching. I took some teaching classes. I took some science classes. I taught high school for a while in Ticonderoga, New York. And I also did a thesis. And my research thesis was on the effects of pinealectomy and on food consumption, weight gain, and fat deposition in golden hamsters. This introduced me to the pineal and introduced me to kind of a research area that I was interested in and kind of still am interested in. And this is, how does the environment impact on the physiology? So how does sunlight, or how does temperature, or how does humidity, how do all these environmental components have an impact on our human physiology? And the way I first started doing that was looking at the pineal gland, which is a well-known gland in the center of your head that produces a hormone called melatonin, which everybody knows about now. But when I was doing it in the 1980s, nobody knew what melatonin was. But it produces the hormone melatonin, which basically tends to tell your body what time of day it is and what time of year it is. So it tells you that it's, if the melatonin levels are high, that's at nighttime when it's dark. And melatonin levels are low, that's daytime. So you kind of know day and night. And then because days are longer in the summer and days are shorter in the winter, you get different levels of melatonin throughout the summer and winter. And that helps to tell your body whether it's summertime or wintertime. And animals like the hamsters use that very often to regulate their reproduction, to tell them, I should reproduce in the spring when food's going to be available, not reproduce in the wintertime, et cetera. And so that was the pineal. So this came to my second fork, which was, should I get a teaching job now that I have this master's in teaching, or should I go on for a higher degree? And so the man I worked with, Dr. Roger Hoffman, convinced me to go work with Mr. Pineal Gland, the guy who was world-renowned for pineal research, and he was in San Antonio, Texas. So I moved to San Antonio, Texas to study the pineal gland with Dr. Russell Ryder. Very, very well-known guy. This is a book by him right here. You can see his name down there. This is melatonin. Newsweek magazine actually put melatonin on the cover in the 1990s. We were all very excited about that because we got good PR. But I arrived in San Antonio in 1980. So that was, a long time ago. But unbeknownst to me at the time, when I arrived at the Health Science Center, I was told I'd have to take all the first-year medical school courses. So I'd have to take, anatomy and physiology and histology, and I'd have to take and pass all those courses. And then I'd have to teach those courses in subsequent years. I was fine with that, and that was actually a really good deal because they were paying me a stipend. So I didn't have to go into any debt to go to graduate school. Excuse me, I could live off of the stipend and basically come out with a PhD with no debt. And as I say, this was kind of my serendipitous introduction to anatomy. I'd never really considered anatomy before that. I'd, of course, done some anatomy and physiology courses, but not any real in-depth anatomy. And I'll talk a little bit more about this particular introduction in a little while, because it was seminal to me. It meant something to me working with deceased individuals to learn how the anatomy works and what happens. So I was there for 4 years. I graduated in 1984 with a PhD in biomedical research and the ability to teach all of these components. And I will tell you, that was a very valuable skill that I learned. Being able to teach those components allows me to get a job just about anywhere. They're always looking for people to teach anatomy or histology or neuroanatomy. If you can teach those content, you can basically find a job just about anywhere. I don't worry about job security. I always know that if this job doesn't work out, I can find a job somewhere else. So that's nice. My dissertation topic was titled "The Hormonal Modulation of Pineal Melatonin Synthesis." So I looked at how melatonin was synthesized and how various hormones would affect that. The endocrine pancreas, insulin, those kind of things, thyroid hormones, and adrenal hormones. Would they have an impact on pineal melatonin synthesis? And that was kind of my dissertation. Happy to share that with any of you who want to read a long, boring scientific dissertation. I have digital copies of it, et cetera. And of course, I published a lot of this material as well. I then, in 1985, went and did a postdoc in Newark, Delaware with Dr. Milton Stetson. I spent 1 year there doing reproductive physiology with him. And then I went back to Texas and accepted an assistant professor position at Texas A&M University in 1985. And my basic role there was to do bench research on the pineal gland and melatonin and to teach anatomy and neuroanatomy to medical students. And that was, your typical assistant professor type of job. Before I go on, I thought I'd point out this picture over here. You see, this is the Texas A&M football team, but notice the red, white, and blue. This was a really cool phenomenon. This was 1 week after 9/11. So you remember the planes going into the towers in 9/11, et cetera. Within a week, we had a football game at Texas. I said like 11 days. There's a football game at Texas A&M. The students of Texas A&M organized T-shirts, either red T-shirts, white T-shirts, or blue T-shirts for sale. They sold them to all the people who came to the game, and all the profits that were raised were sent to New York City to help people after 9/11. It's fascinating to me how organized this is. Probably 60 or 70,000 people, and they organized all those T-shirts, sold all those T-shirts, made all the money, all done by students, all done by undergraduates at Texas A&M at the time. You can see over here is where the visitors come, and even the visitors bought blue T-shirts to wear as well. This area of brown here, this is the Texas Aggie Marching Band, and they always have to wear brown uniforms. So if you see the little scatterings of blue in there, that's actually their girlfriends. They're sitting with the band members that are there. But this was a really fascinating thing to me because, one, it showed how students can organize and do things like your program, right? They really could do amazing things. And it really showed people pulling together. I mean, this was in Texas, thousands of miles away from New York, but they still felt for them. They raised thousands of dollars to send to New York. It was a very, very special time. So with that story, I received promotion to associate professor and tenure in 1991, 6 years after I arrived, which is a pretty typical tenure timeline. Interestingly enough, I'm one of the few people that's ever gotten tenure and promotion without the support of my interim department head or the anatomy faculty. The anatomy faculty basically didn't want me to stick around because they wanted my slot. They wanted my position to be able to put somebody else in. So that was kind of an interesting phenomenon. Turns out that worked out well, though, because, a few years later, I became associate department head and was in line to be department head. So I actually grew through the ranks of the program, et cetera. And so I was there about 17 years. At that point in time, I had to decide, is this what I wanted to do? Did I want to stay at A&M, continue to do research, become more of an administrator, right? Go on and become a department head and do administrative type stuff, et cetera. And I knew what that was like because I'd been doing it for a number of years as the associate department head. I kind of knew what the job entailed. And it really kind of came to me that, no, I really didn't want to do that. And in some ways, it would be better for me, instead of trying to deviate from department head, to leave and do something new and start again. So this third fork was, do I stay the course or do I move on? And I will tell you, for me, that wasn't a very difficult decision, but I know for a lot of people, once they get kind of established into a routine and they kind of know, this is the pathway and this is the way I can go, I think many people would have just done that out of convenience, out of ease, et cetera. But I was really interested in having a change and seeing things that were new. So I actually decided to move on. So in 2003, I resigned from Texas A&M, right? I'd been there 18 years. And I moved to St. George's University in Grenada. For those of you that don't know, that's an offshore medical school where students come from around the United States, actually from around the world, go to medical school there, spend 2 years in Grenada approximately, and then usually 2 years in the United States doing clinical rotations to get their degree. It's a way for students to get into medical school and get a medical degree when they might not be able to get into a medical school in the United States. And I can certainly answer questions about that later if you have interest or would like to know more about that. I will tell you that that was a very good experience, and many of those students there are very motivated students. They really want to be physicians, they want to do the right thing, and they come there and work their way through the process. So I taught histology there, and as I said, as a fun fact, I don't know if it was a fun fact, but as a fact, I actually had Hurricane Ivan pass directly overhead in 2004. I watched the winds come up to about 180 degrees, and then there was this silence when the eye came over. It was about 8 o'clock in the evening. I could go out and kind of see the stars. There was no wind. I went up and talked to a friend of mine in a house nearby, and then the wind started to pick up again. I said, oh, time to go home. Walked back home, and we got the second wave of wind coming around from the other direction. It really did devastate the island of Grenada at that time. I don't know if you remember, but this was kind of right after Katrina. And so, well, it was right before Katrina. So Ivan got a little press, but then when Katrina hit Louisiana, people kind of forgot about Ivan. But for us, it was very devastating. A lot of people lost their homes. Luckily, very few people lost their lives, but it was devastating for the island. And the university couldn't continue to teach there because of the devastation, no electricity, et cetera. So they moved the whole medical school to New York for 6 months. So we went up to New York and taught medical school for 6 months until Grenada could get their feet back on the ground. And then we went back to Grenada again. So in 2000, this is the medical school. This is an old picture. This is what the medical school looked like when I was there in the early 2000s. It's since grown, and it's even larger. And you can obviously go online and look up St. George's, et cetera. But it's a beautiful island, lots of really nice sailing and snorkeling and scuba diving and, all the great things to do that I really did enjoyed that. In 2007, St. George's University decided to set up a satellite campus in England. They wanted to have students from Europe and England be able to go someplace that they didn't have to come all the way to St. George's. And I kind of drew the short straw to go over and help set that satellite campus up. So I spent a year in Newcastle organizing and setting up the satellite campus, getting things organized, as well as teaching gross anatomy and histology to the students. But I did get a little burnt out because it took a lot of time and effort to get all this going, get it all set up, et cetera, et cetera. And so I decided I really didn't want to stay with SGU anymore. I didn't want to continue to do all the administrative stuff in Newcastle. Remember, I'd kind of given that up at A&M, and now I've got more administrative stuff back on my plate with St. George's. So I moved on. So in 2008, that was about 4.5 years after I came to Grenada, I moved to Zurich, Switzerland, spent a year there working at providing some information at the Bioethics Institute at the University of Zurich. And then in 2009, I accepted a non-tenured position at the University of Miami, where I am now. So that was 15 years ago, to teach histology and neuroanatomy. That's what my job was supposed to be. In 2010, the individual, the faculty member who was teaching gross anatomy, sadly had a stroke and was no longer able to teach. And so they came to me and said, hey, could you take over the gross anatomy component as well? And so I took over the anatomy course, and I also took over oversight of the body donation program. The University of Miami runs a body donation program as part of the State Anatomical Board of Florida. And we basically collect donors who donate their bodies for all of the institutions in South Florida. So not just the University of Miami, but Florida Atlantic University, Nova Southeastern, FIU, a number of other institutions. We bring in about 100 donors a year, 100 people donate in about a year, and we provide their bodies to these various institutions. And then the individuals are usually cremated, and their cremated remains can be given back to the loved ones if they'd like. I can talk a little bit more about the donor program, et cetera. It also made an impact on what my future research would be. Because you'll notice that by the time I moved to St. George's, I kind of stopped doing the pineal melatonin stuff. I'd done a lot of publishing in that. I still reviewed some manuscripts and still did, kept my hand in a little bit, but I'd shut down my research lab. I was no longer doing bench research anymore. But when I got to University of Miami, and when I took over the body donor program, I had a kind of a moment where I then realized that I wanted to talk about how these individuals are treated and the appropriate way to treat them, kind of the ethical and moral way to treat these individuals. And so that's led me into my current research area, which I'm doing now, which I'll tell you about. In 2014, 5 years later, I received promotion professor on the non-tenure educator track at the University of Miami, and I was the first faculty member to ever use that pathway. So I kind of blazed that pathway forward and showed that it was possible to be promoted even without the tenure component, et cetera. This was based on my teaching and based on some of my other publishing and some of the other things I did. So again, I kind of helped to blaze that pathway and move that through. But you can see, in some ways, I've had two separate careers. I had the standard career of a research professor, bench scientist doing teaching as well. And then I kind of made a secondary career of being an educator, a medical educator, who does a little research on the side, et cetera, in ethics. I can tell you the reason I like doing that kind of research now is I don't have any postdocs or any laboratory or any research associates or anything. It's just me and my computer and reading papers and writing things up and doing things. I can do it without feeling responsible for the livelihoods of other people and how they're what's happening with them, et cetera. And I enjoy it. I think it's meaningful. I think it's doing good things, and we can talk a little bit about that. So I currently teach anatomy, histo, neuroanatomy to medical students and graduate students. And as I said, I have an interest in the ethical use of human tissues, especially with those who are deceased. And the cover of this journal in academic medicine in 2009 is what spurred me on. Do you see this picture here? This is a hand-drawn picture of a body donor from Philadelphia. All right, we know that because on the inside, there was a little description of the medical student who did it, where she did it, et cetera. And therefore, we have this picture of this woman. This really kind of set things off in my mind, because if this had been a patient, if this had been an actual human patient, that would have been against the law. You would have broken HIPAA, you would have broken privacy rules, you would have broken all sorts of things. And the person doing that would have been sanctioned, had all sorts of things against them. But because this individual was dead and had donated their body, there were no laws, no regulations, et cetera, that protect those individuals, right? And so this was legal. I don't think it was correct, and I don't think it was ethical, but it was legal. And so I wrote a letter to the editor that's listed down here, right? Champney 2010 Academic Medicine, basically saying the picture on this cover is not a good thing, and this is why. And then the editor-in-chief wrote back, and the student who drew the picture wrote back as well. So we had a nice conversation in that issue of the magazine, and you're welcome to read it if you want. But it did set me off on this idea that as soon as someone dies, all the rules and regulations change. When you're alive, there are a lot of protections that protect you. But generally, as soon as you die, you, in essence, become property. You become just a thing, and there are property laws and things like that come into play. But there's really no ethical, moral laws like HIPAA or like the privacy rules, or et cetera, that are involved. And that didn't sit right with me. And so that's what I started to do. So I now publish on this topic. I give talks around the world, internationally, contacted by a lot of news organizations to comment on the ethical issues with human tissue use. You might have seen a couple of those. You may remember there was a scandal at Harvard University where they were stealing body parts to sell them to the oddities market. I have colleagues there. I know that story well. And I actually gave a lot of interviews saying that that was inappropriate, et cetera. And you may have seen the more recent NBC News report out of Texas, in which the counties in Texas were giving unclaimed bodies of people that they didn't know, right, that were all kind of unclaimed. They were giving them to a medical school, and the medical school was then selling them for profit to be used in other places. Again, very horrendous, not ethical at all, but it was a really good NBC News investigation. So if you have interest, you might look that one up as well. That was just a few weeks ago. But again, I do a lot of commentaries on that. I get a lot of people, a lot of news organizations, et cetera, contacting me. So it's been a really interesting growth period for me in this kind of new direction instead of bench. The ability to teach these subjects, as I said, has been really valuable for job security. And the subject matter is also fascinating. I will tell you that I find anatomy and how your body works a really fascinating experience. My father was an engineer. He was an aerospace engineer. And so he loved to take apart cars and put them back together and do all those kind of things. And learning how the body works is in some ways that same engineering marvel, how everything moves well and everything turns around. I will say there are some parts of the anatomy that doesn't work as well as it should. If I was designing it, I would design it a little bit differently. And I have a whole nother talk I could give at some point that's called Anatomical Wonders and Anatomical Blunders. Those parts of the anatomy system that don't work quite as well. So we could talk about that later if you'd like as well. But I do find the whole aspect of anatomy quite fascinating. And as I said, it's really good job security. So if you want to get into it, go get your anatomy training. You have really good job security. So that's my biography. I'd like to spend a few minutes now talking a little bit about one of the areas I'm currently doing work on, and that's how we teach anatomy and how it's relevant to teach anatomy. And it does come historically to me because, as I say here, I took my first anatomy course in 1980, 44 years ago. Right? I'm an old dude. That was a long time ago. But at that point in time, it was a very different experience. We were tasked with just learning the anatomy, just learning the body parts, right? Without considering the individuals who were helping us learn that anatomy. Those bodies that were there, we did not, we didn't think about that. They didn't ask us to think about that. It wasn't relevant. These types of anatomy courses were the norm for anatomy education at that time. Students were required to learn copious amounts of anatomical knowledge. I learned a lot with relatively little clinical relevance at that time. We were always told that we'd be taught the clinical stuff later by clinicians, Right now, you just learn the anatomy, and then we'll add the clinical stuff on later. And at that time, I was with medical students. I was teaching them, and actually, when I first took the course, I was taking the course with them. We were also taught this term called clinical detachment, this idea that you should distance yourself from the body you're working on and therefore from your patients. That you shouldn't get too involved with your patients. You shouldn't have too much emotional involvement because that might bias how you treat them, might make it different than how you treat them. And that was called clinical detachment. I actually think that went a little too far. It made people non-empathetic. They didn't really care about the people. They were just, we got to solve that disease. We got to solve that problem. And sadly, they would end up calling people by their disease. Oh, I have a diabetic in this room, or I have I have a cancer patient in that room. It's an individual who has cancer. It's an individual who has diabetes. And that was kind of lost with this non-empathetic approach of clinical detachment. And as I said, there was no discussion about where the bodies came from or who they were. We were told that the person in there was gone and that the body was just a learning resource, a thing to study and learn anatomy. That was very, very typical 40 years ago. I'll tell you that that's changed. And part of it has changed because of I and my colleagues. We're pushing what we call a new ethos of anatomy education. So this is the old ethos, right? Strictly anatomical, body parts, clinical detachment, keep your emotional distance from your body. The bodies could have come from donors. They might have come from the unclaimed or the identified. We really didn't know. We had no idea where those individuals came from. And then there was what was called this hidden curriculum, where it's this implicit learning of professionalism from educators. You ended up becoming a doctor, basically looking at what everybody else was doing and say, oh, that's how they do it, so I guess I'll do that. There was never anything explicitly taught, but it was like, oh, I see how that guy does it, so I guess I should do it that way too. It's this kind of hidden aspect of learning how to be a professional. And it was very informal, it was very unorganized, and sadly, you might see somebody doing something bad and think that that's the way it should be done because you didn't really know any better, and you thought, oh, that's the way they do it, then I guess I should do that as well. And so that was sad. And in the old days, it was very competitive. You know, it wasn't graded on a curve. It was, you know, whoever got it got the best, and whoever didn't failed out, kind of a thing. Very individualistic because since you were competitive, you didn't want to help your friends do any better. And it was paternalistic and hierarchical. That was the old anatomy. And I'll say with my two other colleagues and I, we have proposed this new ethos of anatomy education, which we recently just published, interestingly enough, in that same journal, Academic Medicine. The one that I mentioned, you know, from 10 years ago that kind of set me off, we've now published this new ethos of anatomy education in Academic Medicine. And I can share that copy with you. It was just published kind of last week, and it's coming out. And so this new ethos is based on learning the clinical anatomy. We don't teach anatomy just for anatomy's sake. We teach the anatomy so that it's relevant to people who are going into healthcare, right? The clinically relevant anatomy. Why should you learn this? Because this thing might break and you need to know how to fix it. Or this doesn't work because of this thing. We teach the clinically relevant anatomy and the various variations. Virtually all the bodies we work with now are donor bodies. And so we say that they're donor bodies, and we treat them as what I call the patient teacher, this individual who's there to help you learn, right? We treat those individuals with respect. We reflect on their death, and we reflect on dying. For many of the students who come into the lab, this might be the first time they've seen a deceased individual. And so it's important for them to think about that, reflect on that, and consider that as an aspect. We humanize that donor, humanize that individual. We allow the students to reflect on that donor and reflect on their altruism. We consider them kind of their first patient, right? Their patient teacher that's going to be giving them information, even though maybe not verbally, right? They get information and things from them that they go. Along with this new ethos, we think there's an explicit role in professional identity formation. So we're going to explicitly lay out, this is how you should behave, and this is the important way to behave, et cetera. We have a lot of role modeling that's involved there. So the way I behave in the lab needs to be appropriate so the students know that that's the appropriate way to behave. And all our faculty are told, this is the way you behave in the lab, because the students are going to think about their behavior based on your behavior and the modeling that you're going to do, et cetera, et cetera. So we're working on professional identity formation in that regard. Here we are here. It's formalized and organized. It may not be assessed. So we're not going to grade the students on how they're getting it, but we are going to make sure that we understand what we want them to accomplish, how we want their professionalism to grow and develop. And it's cooperative and collaborative and not competitive. And we bring in other disciplines like history, ethics, humanities into these areas. So this is one of the diagrams we have. I have it blown up here. This is the old ethos, right? Before 1980, the traditional anatomy education. And then this is the new ethos, right? Where we have the body as the patient or the teacher with explicit role in professional identity formation. So we're saying how anatomy education has changed. Now, I can't say that that's changed in every anatomy department around the country. There's a number of anatomy departments that are working in this regard, but there's still some anatomy departments that are working in that older format. And part of the reason we published this paper was to try to get people to move into this new relational anatomy and how that's relevant and important. The other figure we have in there is a nice figure just to show the interrelationship between the students, the faculty members, and the patient teacher, the donor. And you can see how there's this interrelationship with all of them and how that helps with role modeling, right? It helps with teamwork and peer support, ethical body procurement, right? All those things can be involved in that teaching process. And it's one of the reasons we think working with a donor is so helpful and valuable. You'll never have this same type of relationship if you do it with an AI simulator, or you do it with an anatomage table or something like that. You don't develop that same relationship that's going on. So here's the publication. This is the old journal copy, but this is the publication. That's the old publication. The new publication, I said, has just come out. It's a long manuscript, and it focuses on history-informed ethics and professionalism with a complex interaction between the student, the educator, and the donor. So happy to share that paper with you at any time if you'd like, but I just wanted to kind of show you where we're at in anatomy education and kind of the things we do now through both anatomy education and through anatomy ethics and the ethics of anatomy that take place. So how do I implement that in my medical school, right? And what do I do? So the first is we treat the donor like a patient with respect and dignity. We refer to them as donors or individuals. You may notice I have not been using the word cadaver. I don't think the term cadaver is a very friendly term. It's not a term that we use for respect, right? An example I always like to say is no one says, I'm going to go to the funeral home and see my grandmother's cadaver. Right? They're going to go say, I'm going to go to the funeral home and see my grandmother's body. Or I'm going to go to the funeral home and see my grandmother, right? They refer to that person as an individual. So we don't think that's an appropriate term to be using in the anatomy lab where these individuals have donated their bodies. They are donors, and they did it with an altruistic nature. So we don't use that term anymore. We cover the donors at all times and only undercover that part of the body that's being studied. So for example, if we're going to do a hand dissection and dissect the hand, we don't have them uncover the whole donor. We just have them uncover the hand and have them work on the hand. As I like to say, if I went into a physician and had something wrong with my hand, I wouldn't want the physician to say, take off all your clothes and then I'll look at your hand, right? That's not how the physician should work. And it's the same way that we do that. We're only going to look at work on the area that we want and not the whole donor. We're going to give them the respect and dignity they deserve. We don't put instruments or anything on the donor. We use Mayo trays, which is very similar in surgery. You may notice that anytime you go into a surgical suite, there's nothing put on the patient. All the tools and everything else are put on little trays around the patient. Again, it's kind of a sign of respect, and we want to start that sign of respect early on when we're training healthcare students. So we do similar things that would be done in the surgical suite. And when we're done with the donor, we always put them back together. So if we're studying the heart and the lungs, we take the heart and lungs out, study them, et cetera. But when we're done, we put the lungs back. We put the heart back. We put the chest plate back on. We put these pectoralis major muscles back over. And then because of the way I've designed the dissector, we can put the skin back over as well. So we basically have put that donor back together in kind of a normal position. And we do that every time we're done with the donors. Again, just as a sign of respect for that individual. We don't want them to be little pieces of body parts floating around. We want them to be a whole individual that we're considering, right? And we have a yearly memorial service. Many medical schools do that. And we also have a permanent memorial for the donors as well. Again, just as a way to say thank you and to honor them as well. All right, so those are the ways we do it. And these are the rules that we give to our students. You can see here, we have them sign a rules and regulations form, which I have on the next slide. It'd be difficult to read because it's small, but it basically emphasizes that there's no photography in the lab whatsoever. They're not allowed to take pictures of the donors. They're not allowed to take pictures of anything in the lab. Again, to honor them and respect them. That's just not appropriate. I always tell them no digital information can be taken from the lab. If they want to bring digital information in, if they want to bring their iPad in and look at an atlas or look at a textbook or whatever, that's fine. But they cannot take any pictures or videos or anything else and bring them out of the lab. We just don't think that's respectful or appropriate, right? And as I said here, so they can download stuff, they just can't send it. No phone calls, texting, no Instagram, nothing physical or electronic leaves the lab. This is an area that we treat as kind of sacrosanct, right? We don't allow any visitors in the lab. No medical school applications, no friends, et cetera, et cetera. We say the lab is a place to learn, not a place to show off. If it's not allowed in the operating room, it's not allowed in the anatomy lab. And you're not going to bring your friends into the operating room when somebody's getting surgery done on them. That wouldn't be respectful or appropriate. We're not doing the same thing in the anatomy lab. The converse of that, though, if students want to learn something, I will always open up the lab for them. So if they want to come in and practice suturing, or they want to come in and practice some procedural approach, or they just want to review heart anatomy, whatever it is, we make that available to them because those donors wanted those students to learn. They wanted them to be really good physicians. And so we do everything we can to honor those donors' wishes so that they'll be good healthcare workers, et cetera. Cool. So here's our pledge of respect. Here's our rules and regulations. You can read through them, but it basically says limited access, no visitors, no photography, the kind of the things I've mentioned. Put the donors back together again, right? And the students have to sign that before anybody who comes into the lab, the anatomy lab has to sign this form. So they're well aware of what the rules and regulations are, so that if they were to break them, I will have them, in essence, kicked out of medical school. I will just not accept that. And they can't say, oh, I didn't know, because they've signed this form. So I make everyone who comes in the lab sign that form. So here's the dissection etiquette I talked about, right? How we only dissect that area that we're working on. We cover the donor when we're not working on them. You can see here's that Mayo stand, and you can see all the other things around the patient, but you notice there's nothing sitting on the patient directly, right? So again, that same idea, we try to keep them with that same dignity and that same level of respect. Here's how I tell the students how to keep the lab clean and organized, how to treat the body donors with respect. Learn as much as you can. You have the unique privilege to be able to examine real human tissue. So compare the normal and the abnormal variability in all of the donors. That's a really important thing as well. So these are kind of the rules and regulations that I lay out for any of the students that come into the lab. We have a body donor memorial in which every year we have a yearly ceremony that's done by the students. The students organize it and run it. We invite the family members of the donors to come, and they can hear how their loved ones really enhance the educational aspects of the students. We also have very slideshows that are on display, etc. Besides a body donor memorial, we also have a donor memorial ceremony, right? So this is the ceremony, we call it the rose ceremony. We have one rose for every donor that was used in the lab that year. We have, as I said, family members come, et cetera, et cetera. It's a very, very nice service, really nicely done. It's meaningful for the students. It's meaningful for the families. It's a win-win all the way around. And it's a very, very nice ceremony. And then we do have some, this is the permanent donor memorial we have. You can see we have a little plaque set up, a permanent rose that we do. And we have this displayed outside of the anatomy lab so that anybody who comes by the lab can look at this donor memorial and see it and be reminded of the donors that were there. Interestingly enough, we actually have some paintings and photos and poems that were done by the students. So I've had medical students in the past who did paintings or who did really beautiful poetry. And we've had that framed and we have that put up around the memorial as well, just to show how some of the students were thanking the donors for the things they've done. So that's very nice. And then I will say, we have some donors, families who do not want the cremated remains back, right? They say, no, we'd rather not have the cremated remains. We're not going to bury them or anything. So could you please keep them? And so we have what we call a donor ocean ceremony, in which we take the donor's remains out in these bags, in these paper bags, and we drop them. We go 3 miles out, which is what legally allowed. You can see Miami skyline very far in the background there. And we drop those individual donors in the water. We put a flower behind them, so you can see this little trail of flowers very nicely going off. And we have a little ceremony at sea for them. We mark the GPS site where we drop them, and we can send that GPS information to the family members so they can know exactly when and where their loved one was deposited at sea. This has been a really nice program that we've been doing for about 10 years now, and it's worked out very well. So that's basically the first 2/3 of my talk. I give you a little break here. I'm just going to show you that we have an MS in Biomedical Sciences degree at the University of Miami. Can't really read all this, but you can see the link here. You can see the link here. The QR code works if you want to get information in that. This degree is really for students who come out of college and may not feel prepared for medical school or may not have the grades that they want for medical school. And so they'll spend 1 year with us to boost their grades, as well as get experience in anatomy and biochemistry, doing shadowing, doing some research, et cetera. They get a really good experience, and that really does help them then with their medical school application later on. We get a lot of our students from this program going on to medical school, and you can see here's a class here, and I can give you more information about that if you want, but this is like basically a little PR advertisement for our MS program I thought you might like to see. So here's 2 fun pictures. This is all the bones in your body in words, kind of where they're laid out. I like this by Aaron Kuhn. And this is the underskin, must be like the underline in London, but it shows all the vessels and nerves, et cetera, that are in the body. Again, just kind of some cute anatomy humor. So the last thing I'd like to talk about, and then I'd love to answer your questions, is how we change anatomy courses. And I'm going to give you just one example of the ways that we incorporate unique material into our anatomy course. And I can tell you there's lots of other resources. So we teach about human diversity and variation, which I'm going to talk about, but you can see that there's lots of other aspects about professionalism, about ethics, et cetera. And these are all available at this website. So if you want to go to that website and check it out, you can see that we talk about 3D printing, about dermatome mapping, eponyms, informed consent, and there are 40 other topics. We make this available primarily for anatomists so that they can take that information and incorporate it into their courses, right? Ways to improve their courses and make their courses kind of more ethical and have more professional development in their courses. And this is John Cornwall. He's from the University of Otago in New Zealand. This is Sabine Hildebrandt. She's from Harvard University. And that's me from the University of Miami. The three of us are kind of called the bioethics unicorns. John coined that phrase. We find it a cute little phrase. And so we actually have webinars every quarter, every 3 months, we have a little bioethics unicorn webinar in which you talk about an ethical topic or a professional development topic in and around anatomy. And we have, I have an email list that we put people on. They come and provide presentations. So if any of you would like to be on that email list, you can again email me and I can put you on that list if you'd like to come to any of our webinars. All of our previous webinars, there's now 13 of them, have been posted online here at the same website. So you can go back and look at a lot of the old webinars as well and their postings. So this is something we will talk about to our students when they first come to the anatomy lab. And it's a way to introduce them to human diversity and human variation, something they may not have thought about in the past. So human diversity, the bodies come in very different shapes and forms. And I really like this picture. Look at the difference in skin tone, right? All the way along. Yet these are all human individuals. They all basically have the same anatomy, but you can see that there is variety and there is variation that occurs, right? That can be age, size, sex, skin tone, as you can see here, ethnographic origin, whether they've had surgical or physical modifications. All these things can be involved, as well as socioeconomic factors like diet. If somebody doesn't eat very well growing up, they're not going to be as tall. They're not going to be as well developed. So there's all these factors that impact on how we are a diverse group of individuals, right? And this is another picture I really like. It comes from Board Panda. But notice these are all athletes in the prime of their sport, right? They're kind of Olympic-based athletes. And yet look at the variety that occurs here, right? The size, the shape. Yet this is what we typically consider of the typical anatomy, right? This kind of typical white dude. But it's not true. The anatomy spans all of that. And that's one of the nice things about having an anatomy lab. I have about 20 to 24 donors in my lab almost all the time, and I get to see this same kind of variation in anatomy. Now, they're not all Olympic athletes, of course, but we do get to see the small little woman and the very large male, right? And the students get to appreciate that wide range of what we call the common form, right? And as I say, your patients will represent this broad swath of humanity, so you should prepare yourself for that. Be aware of that variety that takes place. And besides this kind of normal variety, we have variety that's, I don't want to say abnormal, but is what we call variations, variations upon that. Some are, as I say, fairly large, but others are very minor, with the owner maybe unaware of them even occurring, right? So one of those that's not very large, and you may not even know if you have it, is where your posterior ventricular artery runs. That's an artery that runs on the back of the heart and supplies the posterior side of the heart. But in about 60% of the individuals, it comes off the right coronary artery. And in about 20% of individuals, it comes off the left coronary artery. And in those other 20% of individuals, it comes off the left and the right coronary. There's actually two branches, right? I don't know what I have in mine. Many of you don't know what you have in yours. but there is that variety that just normally occurs, okay? So that's the coronary artery. And usually, as I said, this doesn't matter. I mean, it's not going to make any big difference. But if you need to do bypass surgery because somebody has a clot in that artery, you might want to know where it arises from to be able to find how to do the bypass and where to bypass over. So it could be relevant there, right? So this is a relatively minor but very unique variation. There's some that can be very, very large. During development, when you're in the uterus, in the embryo, right? When you're embryo in the uterus, there are cilia that beat. And those cilia that beat determine whether your heart is on the left side of your body or your right side of your body, whether your liver is on your left side of your body or your right side of your body, right? And there are some people who that cilia doesn't work very well, and they get everything flipped over. It's called situs inversus. And so you can see here that the heart is over on this side, the liver is over on that side, right? Everything is rotated, okay? I had a donor, must be about 8 years ago, who came into the lab. We didn't know it until we opened that donor up and we found that they had situs inversus. It was like Christmas time. It was like, ooh, what a cool present we have. Isn't that cool? Because that individual had everything reversed. And we figured they probably knew it because remember, if your heart's on the left-hand side and you try to hear the heartbeat over there underneath your C4 level, you're not going to be able to hear it. You know it's going to be on the other side. So we figured that individual probably knew it, but he didn't tell us. That was a nice surprise that he gave us. It was a really, really cool thing to see. Right? So partly with human variation, we also want to point out this kind of quote that if you want to know if something's abnormal, you have to know what is normal, right? Look at that eye. You understand that there's something wrong with that eye because sclera should not be red. You know normally by looking at lots of other individuals that the sclera is usually white. You see the sclera is red, you say, oh, that's not normal. Why? Because that's what you've experienced in your life. But it doesn't necessarily mean that there might be some unintended biases. If you only see certain people at certain times, you're not necessarily going to understand that there's more variety in those people, that there's more variation that occurs. Likewise, this individual here, you can see that those fingers are kind of melded together. That's called syndactyly. And again, you will understand that that's not normal. Why? Because you know that normally we should have 5 digits that are separate and can move individually. Right? But again, if everybody had their digits fused like this, we would think that was normal. And we would think this was not normal, right? So again, it's all based on what your experiences are and how those are developed, right? And maybe they might incorporate unintended biases. So first off, I hope you can see there's something unique on this side, right? Which way is the heart pointing? It's actually pointing over to the right. In fact, there's a little R right up here that says it's pointing to the right, right? So this is a patient with situs inversus. The heart's on the wrong side. And notice this little bubble here. This is a gas bubble inside the stomach. Well, the stomach shouldn't be here. The stomach should be over here in normal anatomy. So the stomach's on the opposite side, and that means the liver is over here on this side, right? So this is a person who has total situs inversus on both sides, right? I hope you can see what's different here. That individual has a really S-shaped spine, right? That's called scoliosis, very not uncommon, but we know that that's not normal because we already know what we consider to be normal, right? And normal is to have a straight vertebral column that comes straight down, right? So hopefully you can see that. And then this is a real fun one. Many of you might have seen this in the past. Do you see anything wrong with this radiograph? Well, if you look carefully, you'll see there's a gorilla over here, right? The gorilla shouldn't be in the lung. The reason that was done, this is a study, you can see the paper down here if you want to go look at it. They showed this picture to lots of radiologists, and many of those radiologists missed this gorilla. Why? Because you're not looking for a gorilla in the lung. You never expect to find a gorilla in the lung, so they didn't expect to find it there. They're looking down here at these little nodules, they're looking at all sorts of other things, right? They don't see the gorilla because it's not an expected finding. And that's a point we like to make as well. Be aware of the unexpected. Don't expect all your patients to be normal, to have all the normal things. Keep in mind that they may be unexpected, right? They may have a gorilla in their lung or something like that, that you can think about and check out. right? And so here again is another one of those human diversity pictures. Look at the variety of all those individuals, yet they're all women, right? They all have two X chromosomes, but look at the variety that's occurring through all that. This individual doesn't have any normal anatomical legs, but she has legs, right? See all the variation that's taking place through here, yet it's all normal. Okay, cool. And then there's this level of diversity. We just have these nice pictures of all the different types of diversity that you can see, right? In individuals, age, body shape and morphology, families, etc. And we want students to think about that and be aware of that, to not get siloed into just one form of human anatomy and what's appropriate in human anatomy. And that is all I have to tell you about. I took my picture of sailing here and I put my textbook. So if you're ever interested, I have a textbook on essential clinical neuroanatomy. You can check that out if you want another little PR plug. But this is a neuroanatomy textbook that I wrote a few years ago. So here are the bioethics unicorns, right? We actually have cards. Isn't that cool? I made up little blue cards that have stuff on the back. Here's a little QR code for that as well. If you ever see me at a meeting or see me in person, I can give you one of these cards. They're really cool. So, and then the last thing I have is some references that you're certainly welcome to look at. And I can tell you more about them as well if you'd like in the future. So that is all I have. I'm going to stop sharing. I see that there are lots of questions in the chat. I hope they're questions. So let's see. I'm going to start at the top and then work my way down. And then you guys can always ask me questions also. So I see one here. Will we be able to access the presentation afterwards? Yes, you should. I'm more than willing to share it with you. So if you want to email me, I can send you the PowerPoint copy of it. But you see that Abraham wrote back, it's recorded. So you can always look at the recording as well. So either way is fine with me. It's recorded. There you go. There's some emails. How cool, yada, 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 yada. I'm looking at your questions. Anyone who wants to obtain the presentation, please share their email. There you go. Look at all those emails. Very cool. Feel free to think of any questions you'd like to ask. Thank you, Abraham. I like that as well. Would love to go over the anatomical blunders. So I'll give you one that I always find fun. Those of you might know that there's a sinus up here in your cheek called the maxillary sinus. And we have all these air-filled sinuses around our head that are filled with air. You guys know when you get sinusitis, right? You get this stuffy nose, it all fills up, etc. This maxillary sinus here, actually the drain for it, how you get fluid out of it, is superiorly. The only way it would drain is if you drained upwards. So the only way we can really drain it is to put our head over like this, and then you'll feel it drain out. Or to put your head like that and have it drain out. Why is that? Well, we were once this way, right? Our vertebral column this way with our head up here and our tail down there. And remember, we went upright like that, right? So we went from this way to that way. In doing that, a lot of anatomy changed. And one of the anatomy things that changed was that maxillary sinus. That maxillary sinus used to drain this way. It just drained anteriorly. But now when we went up, that maxillary sinus is now draining upwards. The story I like to tell is I do a lot of snorkeling and scuba diving. I go out scuba diving. I come back after scuba diving, and I'll lie down to take a nap. And as I lay down and put my head down, I feel this little trickle coming out. Why is that? Because my maxillary sinus is filled up with saline, with salt water. And when I tip my head over, now it starts to drain out of that maxillary sinus, right? There are people that get maxillary sinusitis, that get recurrent maxillary sinusitis because they don't have good superior drainage that takes place. That can sometimes impact on their upper teeth, can cause abscesses of the upper teeth, and lots of other bad things. So it's one of those design features that isn't very good. And I have lots of others. So at some other point, we can talk about them, but there's lots of others of them that go on. On the topic of clinical detachment, do you believe this leads to and possibly bred some of the God complex? It may have. I actually think that those are kind of two separate things. I think the God complex really kind of developed because we kind of put all of our medical professionals on a pedestal. We said, ooh, we need to listen to them. We need to figure out what's best. And, you know, these are the best and the brightest. They got the best grades. They're the smartest. Just because you're smart doesn't necessarily mean that you're empathetic. or that you're, or you're ethical. So those aren't equalities. And I think that was bad of us to elevate our medical professionals to that level of, ooh, they're so bright, they all must know what is correct and what needs to be done. I don't think the clinical detachment helped because it reduced that empathy. The doctors didn't really think about that patient and how that, what was best for the patient, as opposed to just curing the disease or whatever. But the God complex is true. I think we're getting rid of that little by little. Interestingly enough, if you go to other countries where medical professionals don't make as much money and aren't as held in high esteem, there's less of that kind of God complex that goes around. There you go. I'm open to either, whatever works best. This is my first. Thank you very much. Thank you as well. Hopefully that answered the question, Jenna. Everybody good with that? Happy to wax more philosophic. And it's dehumanizing, right? Certain surgeries, it can be recorded with patient consent. That is correct, but you have to get specific consent from them. And I want to make sure that I call that ethical consent. I consider there's two types of consent. There's legal consent, and then there's ethical consent. Legal consent is, I'm asking you to sign this form so you don't sue me, right? And that's what you do when you really go to any of your doctor's offices. So all those forms you're signing, you're not really signing them ethically. You're signing them to protect them legally so that you won't sue them if things go bad or things happen. Unethical consent, on the other hand, is a consent of knowledge, of informed consent. So they're going to come to you and they're going to say, these are the things we want to do. Are you okay with that? Do you understand what that means? And can we educate you more about that? And so if they truly have an ethical informed consent, then I'm okay with that and having it recorded. And these if you get that type of consent, appropriate consent, it does avoid some of the violations of HIPAA, but you have to certainly have that paperwork done and make sure that paperwork is very, very clear, right? First, AI is going to affect the medical field. What should we do to prepare it? So interestingly enough, I'm giving a talk on AI and anatomy. When is that? November 7th. I have to look here on my calendar. Yes, November 7th at 4 p.m. for a national podcast on anatomy, on AI. So that national podcast is looking at AI in a bunch of fields. And this version of the podcast is on AI and anatomy. So we'll be talking about that. I think there will be some benefits of AI, for instance, making sure your medical chart is done right and that there's all good information in it, et cetera, to get information in. Where AI will never be able to work is in the doctor-patient relationship, where you have one human talking to another human who can have empathy and can sort things out. We wrote a paper a year or two ago on AI in the anatomy lab and how we feel that AI will never replace body donors in the anatomy lab because those body donors bring with them a history. They are actual humans. And when you walk into the lab and you see that individual lying there, you know that was a living human at one time. And you understand what that's like. And that's something you'll never capitulate, you'll never make with AI. You'll never have AI, have people humanize about AI and say, oh, that poor AI, it lives such a good life, or things along that line. They're not going to have that empathy, et cetera, et cetera. So we think there are ways that AI might improve, but it's not going to change all of medicine. Medicine is still going to be a relationship between that healthcare provider and that individual, hopefully on a human-to-human basis with empathy, et cetera. What was the hardest day in your career like? That's a good question. So from a intellectual point of view, probably the hardest day in my life was when I defended my PhD thesis, right? That's the time I'd written the whole thesis. I have lots of knowledge stuck in my head. And here's these guys who are very knowledgeable, asking you all sorts of questions, et cetera, right? They're intellectually challenging you. What about that point? And what about this thing, et cetera? So that was probably the most intellectually challenging. I've had some hard days in my career. I've had some times when I was not necessarily happy with the way things were going. I've been disappointed with some things that have occurred in curriculum or with students or things of that nature. But I can't tell you that there's like one day that sticks out that like, oh, that was the worst day in my life, you know? I tend to be generally optimistic, and I'm always looking forward to what's going on in the future. And so anything that goes bad, for at least for me, that's a learning opportunity. And I say, oh, that happened, so maybe I shouldn't do that again, or maybe we should do this, or maybe we should move on in that direction. So it's difficult for me to say definitely hardest day, but average day look like. So one of the nice things about my field, about kind of this aspect of it, is that you can do things when you want. There are certain things you have to do. Like if I have to give a lecture at 1 o'clock, I have to give a lecture at 1 o'clock. I had to give a lecture at 8 o'clock this morning. I had to get up extra early. I had to go in and give that lecture because that's an assigned time. But outside of assigned times, then my time is really my own, right? And I can decide if I want to write an article or read an article or do some work with a colleague or, you know, do other things. It really there's a lot more flexibility and a lot more freedom that's involved when you're in the academic kind of PhD environment. And I will say that's different than if you're in the medical environment. If you're in the medical environment, you're always being driven by outside forces. There's a patient that needs to be seen. You need to fill out these forms. You need to do this, right? There's all these outside forces that are encroaching on your time, saying you need to do this, you need to do that. And you don't have much freedom to schedule when you want to do things. You can't say, no, I don't really want to do that surgery this morning. I think I'll do it tomorrow, right? If that surgery is scheduled, you have to do that surgery. In the academic world, there's a little more individual freedom and a little more ability to do the things you want to do. So for me, a typical average day is going into work, maybe giving some lectures, maybe working in the lab, setting it up for a future lab, or going into the lab to help students in the lab. I'll break my day up into some teaching and lab work, as well as then some writing. So I'll investigate some new research topic, or I'll investigate some new ethical topic that I would like to discuss, and I'll pick up references and start doing work and start writing some stuff up. Maybe start writing a new textbook. I have a couple of textbooks on the shelf that I need to write. I would like to write a textbook on anatomical blunders and anatomical wonders. So that may come in the future as well. But it is nice that I have that variability, and I can take a day off. If I don't have any teaching that day, I can say, I'm not going into work. I'll just stay at home, or I'll go sailing. I'll go do something else. But I might end up having to work on a Saturday to put a lecture together or do something else. So I like having that freedom. And that's one of the nice things about being in the academic profession. What is something you wish you knew before entering research that you know now? Another good question. I guess the thing I'll tell you is the thing that frustrated me the most with research was trying to get the grant money, was trying to get the funding to do the research that I wanted to do. I really liked all the other aspects of it. I liked doing the research. Again, I could kind of plan the schedule when I was going to do my animal research, when I was going to do my radioimmunoassays or my HPLC, when I was going to do the statistics, when I was going to write the paper. And I liked that variety, and I liked being able to kind of do it when I wanted to do and organize it, et cetera. The thing I really didn't like was having to get the money to be able to run all of that, right? And writing the grants is not fun. And I feel it's a little like telling lies, because you have to write things and say, I'm going to cure cancer, or I'm going to solve the problems of the universe. But in reality, you're not going to do that. And I always felt like it was kind of being hyperbolic and kind of stretching the truth, et cetera. And I didn't like that component of it. And then it's not like you're getting it for the rest of your life. You're only getting it for 3 years, and then you have to do it all over again, and you have to keep doing it. It can be quite frustrating. And then on top of that, you have the responsibility of a technician or a postdoc or a graduate student that you're, keeping in the lab, but you need to have the money in order for them to have their livelihoods and do things as well. And that responsibility weighed heavy on me as well. I always wanted to make sure that they were being well taken care of, et cetera. That meant I had to get the money to do that, and that puts more stress and kind of more responsibility. So that's one thing I would tell anybody who's going into the field. Just be aware of that if you're going to go into a research field that requires money. Now, the nice thing about what I'm doing now is it doesn't require money, right? I'm not doing any bench research anymore. And I will tell you, it's really great because I'm just being paid to teach. All of my salary is just to teach the anatomy, et cetera. All of this research I'm doing, all this ethics and everything else, I do it because I like doing it, because I think it's valuable, because I think it's, providing us, moving the needle forward in the right direction. So that's a really nice feeling. I don't have the responsibility that I have to do it. I don't feel the drive that, ooh, if I don't do this, I'm not going to get promoted or something's not going to happen. And I don't have the responsibility of paying for graduate students' salaries or technician salaries, et cetera, et cetera. So that hopefully answers that question. Is it possible to do a dual major in biology and biomedical sciences? Most definitely. I mean, I did my dual major early on in biology and marine biology. Depending on the university you go to, that's just going to depend on what those universities offer. So it's really what the offerings are at the specific university, and you'd have to find out what that is. And what's your opinion about basic science nurses going to medical school? I think that's fine. I think anybody who has healthcare interests could do any of those pathways. I will say, though, that you don't have to be a doctor to give really good healthcare. Right? You can be a PA. My personal physician is actually a PA, and I really like him. He's a really great guy. You can be an LPN. You can be a nurse practitioner, an NP. There's lots of ways that you can impact on patients positively that is not being the MD, right? Not having the MD behind your name. Now, there's some value to it, and there's some good parts to it and some bad parts to it. But I really think it's valuable to think about healthcare as a whole and how you're going to have the most impact on those individuals and what way that will work. So there's lots of opportunities out there in the healthcare environment, and you don't necessarily have to limit yourself to, ooh, if I don't get the MD, my life's going to be over. I've had a number of students who started medical school and just couldn't handle medical school, and that's fine. At least they know that, and then they can change their careers, go get a PhD or go get a PA or go get a NP, right? Go get some other degrees like that. And they can have just as much impact on patients, if not more, right? So that can be very valuable. BSM, what was the worst thing that happened in the lab? So I don't know, I haven't had any really bad things in the lab because I'm really strict in the lab. I slap people's wrists all the time if they try to do anything bad in the lab. But I will tell you, I had an individual, this must be 5 years ago, so we allow the lab to be open 24/7. So the students can be in there at any time studying if they want. They know the rules and they're supposed to follow those rules. And they know I will come down on them if they don't. But we do allow them in there 24/7. So over the weekend, some students were in studying, and another student came over to that donor who happened to be a large black male. That donor was a large black male. And that male student came over and said, let's see how this donor is hung, and pulled the cover back, right? So the other students around there were aghast, like, what's happened? But they were from a different class, so they didn't recognize who that individual was. They came to me the next day and basically said, this is what happened. I read the riot act to the whole medical class that was involved. They said, I don't know who did this, because this is totally inappropriate in the lab, right? This is not how we treat, you should not treat patients that way, and you shouldn't treat our donors that way as well. And because I didn't know who it was, I said the whole class is losing 2 points. Everybody's losing 2 points. You're not going to get those, everybody's grade is 2 points lower. Sorry. I said, I'm just really annoyed, and that's what happened. Oh, the class went ballistic. Oh, that's so unfair. We didn't do anything, et cetera, et cetera. Finally, one student came up to me and said, Dr. Champney, it was me. I really apologize. I made that student do a whole lot of work, et cetera. I had that student lose extra points, and I actually gave the points back to the other students who lost it. But what I will tell you is that word got around, right? And subsequent classes and subsequent students knew that they're not going to do anything bad in the lab, or Champney's going to come at them with a vengeance. I tell you, I am there first and foremost for those donors, right? Secondarily, I'm there for the students. But I'm there for those individuals who donated their bodies for these students to learn from. And that's my job, is to make sure that they get treated appropriately with the respect and dignity that they deserve. And I will, I'll let people know if that doesn't happen. So that, I don't know if that's the worst thing that happened, but I think it's a really good example of how we deal with things. And sadly, that doesn't always happen in anatomy labs. There are anatomy labs where that kind of stuff is just taken for granted. It's kind of, oh yeah, that's just kids having fun, ha 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 ha, playing around or whatever. It will not happen in my lab, but sadly, not all labs are like my lab. So, you do have variety, and we're trying to, I said, change that ethos, right? We're trying to change that ethos to get more labs to behave in the proper and the ethical manner. But yeah, so for undergraduate students, what kind of research do we get in our college years in order to prepare for medical school? To tell you the truth, it doesn't really matter. I would say if it's healthcare related research, that's going to be somewhat more beneficial. So if you can go volunteer to work on a research project, right? Some sort of healthcare research project, or you can volunteer to do research on, human subjects, something along that line. That's probably more valuable, but in reality, research is not that big a component to get into medical school. What's going to be more valuable is having a good academic record, right? Doing well on exams and doing well on your MCATs, and secondarily, having very good shadowing experiences. Going out and seeing what physicians do on a daily basis. So try to find some physicians that you can go spend a couple days with, see what their life is like, because that's really important for you to know if you want to get into that livelihood, right? You can follow a physician on a day-to-day basis and say, yeah, I like what he does in his life, or gee, I don't like what's going on in that life, and I'd rather not do that. Get a lot of those experiences, and I think the shadowing experiences and the academic performance are more important than the research component. I've served on a lot of admissions committees when we look at medical school students, et cetera, and I will say that research is looked at, but it's not looked at as a strong component, right? Academics and shadowing are much larger components that are looked at there. So you could even do other research if you wanted to. It wouldn't really matter. It's good to have a little bit, understand the research process, understand how research is done, but it's not as large a component. Are there research opportunities that are remote that you know of? That's difficult. There are some programs, I think, that do offer kind of online research experiences where you can do like meta-analyses of public papers and things like that. You just really have to contact the individual institution and find out what that institution would allow or could occur as well. But it can kind of happen. PH is making one right now. There you go. Same. What was it like growing up in the medical field with inequality gender-wise and racial-wise? Yeah, it was there. It's really interesting in that it was there, but you never really noticed it because it was the norm, right? So when I went through medical school, I would say 80% of the people in that medical school were white guys like me. Right. And then there were some women, maybe a few minorities or whatever, but no one ever really thought about it because it was the norm. It was what was expected kind of a thing. Right. So it's not like we were enlightened somehow and said, oh, this is bad, this is wrong, it shouldn't happen. Luckily, that's changing over time. And that's part of this development of this kind of new ethos as well. But looking back on it, I didn't like it because it gave us a very narrow, insular view of what humans were like and what anatomy was like, et cetera, right? We didn't see that broad variety, that broad range that makes the human population. And so in some ways, that's kind of sad, and I'm sad I missed out on that. I think it's a richer experience, a better opportunity if you think about the large variety and the large variation that's taking place in the human population. Yes, I know Hawaii has a really good body donor program. I know a couple of the people at the University of Hawaii in Honolulu, and the program that they do, they actually go out in the outriggers and will place the cremated remains out in the outriggers as well. Very nice program. I know, I said, some of the faculty members there and some of the programs that they do. Yeah, they're silent donors, right? We learned a few things about the donors, their name, occupation, and some pathology. That's correct. I will tell you, I've instituted a new program, again, this is about 5 or 7 years ago, where we asked the donors to provide information that they would like. So, for instance, they'll write a little biography of what their life was like and things they like. They'll send us some pictures of when they were 30 years old and when they were 60 years old, All of that information we put on the donor tank, so that anytime a student walks up to that donor, they can read this little life story, this little life history. We only take what they volunteer. We don't put anything that they don't volunteer, but many of our donors like to write about their life, like to write about why they want medical students to learn from them, what's valuable, et cetera, et cetera. This really humanizes the donor, and it really makes the students to think about that person as an individual and not just as a thing to learn from. And so I've been very happy with that program. At some point, I would like to take all those stories and put them together in a little book called Lives Lived or something like that, these donor stories, because they are very nice stories. We had one guy who was 103 years old. He was a professor at another university. He had come to the United States in the 1930s to avoid the Nazis. As a relatively young child, was a child prodigy. He told us about the things he did, et cetera, et cetera. We've had other stories, a couple other nice stories. We had one donor who was a huge University of Miami fan. He loved the University of Miami. And he had a University of Miami hat that he wore everywhere. He wanted that University of Miami hat to stay with him. So we kept that in the tank with him the whole time he was with us, right? The students didn't really know that because we kind of buried it back underneath the body bag, but we kept that with him. We had another donor who had a rock that he kept in his pocket his whole life. It was some special little rock that was meaningful to him, and he wanted that rock to stay with him. So we kept that rock in the tank with him as well, right? We will do whatever we can to honor the donors in the way that's best for them and to provide humanity to the donors for our students. So like I said, this biographical information we get is really, really nice. And it's a really nice way for the students to kind of meet the donors and think about them. So nice to see that goes to other things. And Tony, you can bring that back to Hawaii, some of those other ideas as well. You can let them know about that. Can you suggest one medical reading you found highly valuable during the early stages of your career? So early on in my life, I did a lot of work with animals, right? I did a lot of work with hamsters and rats and gerbils, et cetera. And I was very involved in the animal care committee, making sure that the animals were taken well care of, et cetera. And I read a lot of the animal rights stuff. So Peter Singer wrote a really seminal book on animal rights in the 1984 that was very quite good and really made people think about what's the appropriate way to treat animals and animal rights. So that was a good book. If you're going to work with animals, I think reading about animal rights and kind of animal ethics is important as well. Other one. I can't think of anything right off the top of my head, but I'll give that a little thought and I'll answer a few more questions. Students first learning anatomy or any other first-year medical courses, what specific things should they be focused on to succeed? So in that regard, I tell the students a couple things. One, I say, try to find a group of students to work with together. You will all do better if you work together as a group. If you quiz each other and say, oh, I think it's this. No, I think it's that. Well, why do you think it's that? And talk about it and talk amongst yourselves. I tell students, get together once a week and really hash things out with each other, what's going on and what's happening. I think that really does raise everybody's value. They all do better when they work together. That comes down to the point of being cooperative, not competitive. So work together to make all your grades better, as opposed to trying to be competitive with each other and end up hurting each other because you're not learning as much. So the cooperation works really well, and this work and studying together. I tell students not to focus on the grades, especially once you're in medical school, because this is your profession. You're going to be doing this the rest of your life. Don't focus on the grade, focus on the knowledge. What are you going to learn here that's going to be valuable for you as a physician in the future, that you're going to use to help save people's lives? In some ways, if you put your emphasis there and start thinking about the context and the concepts and the things that are going to be valuable for you, it gives you motivation to learn them. And I think it can be very helpful and very valuable. You can even do well on assessments in some ways, but well on exams as well. But you're not concentrating on the exam as much as you're concentrating on the knowledge and the information that's going to be helpful to them, right? I think that can also be very helpful when you're starting to study. And then the last thing is, if you can, think about the best way that you learn. So some people learn by reading, some people learn by visual components, some people learn by listening to things. Some will learn by writing things out, drawing diagrams, etc. You should try to assess what's your best way of learning and try to use that modality, because that'll be the most efficient. Nothing in medical school is individually that hard. What's hard about medical school is the quantity of information that comes at you. We say it's a fire hose of information just shooting out at you, right? It's a lot of information. No one little bit of information is really that hard, but it's just the quantity. So if you can find an efficient way to learn as much of that quantity as possible, that's going to help you out in the long run, right? So figure out the best way that you learn, makes you the most efficient learner, and that can actually work out quite well. And then also take time for yourself. Do something outside, running, reading, whatever it is that you find enjoyable, make sure you set aside some time for that. You're going to be a better person if you give yourself the time that you need for other things besides just study, learn, right? And believe it or not, you'll study and learn more if you've been rested and you're in the proper frame of mind, et cetera, et cetera. So don't think that it's always the amount of time you invest that's going to make you a better learner. Sometimes you can invest less time, but it's more efficient time. And then you can take a break and do other things and come back and do that more efficient time as well. So don't necessarily think a 5-hour study session is going to be as valuable as maybe short half-an-hour study sessions with little breaks in them every so often. Okay, that's some of my advice. Do you think the issue of overworking and underhiring for medical professionals is going to be addressed at some point in the future? I don't know. I wish. There's a couple problems there. One of them, of course, is the residency bottleneck. We don't have as many residency slots as we do as kind of MDs coming out. And so it's difficult to get into that residency bottleneck. And then once they're in there, those residents are really kind of abused. They're kind of overused and abused, and that's inappropriate as well. Is that going to be addressed? Well, one way they could address it is by making more residencies available. The other way I would like to see that happen, this is my ivory tower kind of, moral way I'd like to see it happen, is to overemphasize primary care and to underemphasize specialty care. As it is now, specialty care gets all the emphasis. It's where all the money is. It's where all the prestige is. Go be a neurosurgeon or go be, some really high specialty. And the people who are doing the primary care, the pediatricians, the family physicians, et cetera, they don't get paid very much, and they don't get the same level of respect. I would love to see that balance out more, where the people who are doing primary care are getting paid as much as the people who are doing the specialty care, right? And if that would occur, I think that would shift the balance and might help some of this imbalance that's taking place. As it is now, people come out of medical school with a lot of debt, and they say, geez, to pay that debt off, I better go into a specialty that's going to make me more money so I can pay that debt off quicker, right? Instead of going into family practice where I may never be able to pay that debt off because I'm not making as much money in the process. So I would love to see more equity that would take place there, et cetera. I don't know how that would necessarily occur. I said this is kind of the ivory tower thing I'd like to see happen. But how you're going to make that equity occur would be difficult to do. I'm interested in learning more about St. George's or anything that one should know about applying to attending a school outside the US. St. George's has changed in the past 10 years since I've been there. It was bought out by a large company. It used to be owned by a single individual, Modica. He was a really nice guy, and he ran a very good organization. He has since sold it, and it's become a little more commercialized. It's become a little more money-making and less making good physicians. You can still become a good doctor there, but it's going to take a little more work. And I will tell you that any of the offshore schools, you can get your MD degree, but it's going to take a lot more work, a lot more motivation than it would in the United States. In the United States, kind of once you're in the pathway, it's pretty easy to get through that pathway. Offshore, it's going to be a little more challenging, but it takes place. I can tell you, I will eat lunch at the hospital cafeteria every so often, and I'll have basically strangers walk up to me and say, oh, Dr. Champney, you taught me at St. George's years ago, and this person's a resident, or they're a faculty member, or they're somebody else. So you can succeed and move through these programs, but it does take more time and effort. I generally think there's three of the strongest programs in the Caribbean are St. George's, Ross, and American University of the Caribbean. Right, Ross is on Barbados now. It used to be on Dominica, and American University of the Caribbean is in St. Martin. Those are probably the three strongest of the and best known and oldest of the offshore schools. There's lots of others of them. Many of them are not as well respected and can be problematic. But you can look them up online. There's lots of chats out there about these various schools that you can see. There's offshore medical forums that you can read students' interpretations of how they feel they've gotten a good education or not. But it is a way to get a medical education. There's nothing wrong with that. And I've seen very good doctors come out of Caribbean medical school. So there's, it's not an inappropriate way to get your degree. Would you recommend taking human anatomy courses in undergrad? It's not going to hurt. Some of those human anatomy undergrad courses are quite good courses. Others of them are relatively simplistic and add a lot more physiology in. It's not going to, if anything, you're going to at least learn some of the nomenclature. You're going to learn what anterior and posterior, medial, lateral, superior, inferior. You're going to kind of learn some of the ways to talk about and how these things work. So you come in with a little better preparation. When we teach anatomy, we don't necessarily assume that students have had that. So we end up, teaching that to begin with. So if you'd already had that, it would just be review to build on top of that. So it's not necessarily a requirement, but I think it can be helpful. I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with it. Is there a law that a family member can treat another family member? There's not necessarily, I don't know if it's a law necessarily, but it's a unwritten rule that you should never treat your family members. And the reason for that, it's not the clinical detachment aspect of it. It's kind of the opposite aspect of that. You're too emotionally involved, right? And so you might not be able to make good decisions about what's happening with your family member. So it's almost always good to have another physician actually in charge. That doesn't mean you can't give some input, right? And can't have valuable knowledge that you might be able to provide, but you shouldn't be the primary decider of their healthcare because you have an emotional attachment to them that could change you, could have bias that might take place there. So do you think that law should change or not? Yeah, again, I don't know that it's a real law per se. But I think we do need to be careful about that because if you get too emotionally involved, you may actually cause more suffering than cause healing, right? You may say, oh, I really don't want my loved one to have this surgery, or I really don't, because you just feel for them so much, when in reality, that might be the best thing for them. And so it's difficult situation to situation, but you always have to kind of be a little bit careful about that. So. How do you handle patients you've known for a bit or relate to without becoming emotionally attached? That's difficult. But there's nothing wrong with having a certain level of emotional attachment, right? I like to say you can kind of be friendly, right? You can kind of have a relationship. It should not be a close relationship. They shouldn't be buying you Christmas presents. They shouldn't be buying you birthday presents, etc. In fact, in some ways, they really shouldn't know when your birthday is. You shouldn't be having a personal friendship. You should be having a professional relationship, right? And that's how you should establish that with your patients. It's a professional relationship. And just like I don't know, your tax guy, right? Or these other people you have professional relationships with, that's how it should be. Now you're going to talk about very serious things, maybe some illnesses, maybe some diseases, right? Things of that nature that are very serious and require serious conversation. But it should be done in a professional manner and not in a friend-to-friend manner in that regard. And sometimes that's difficult because sometimes patients become emotionally attached to you and you have to try to make sure there's some distance there, right? Not accept their Christmas present or say, oh, thank you very much, this is really nice, but I don't feel it's appropriate for me to accept it. I'm going to give it to the local charity, right? Something along that line. So they can kind of see where those boundaries are and kind of understand where those boundaries are as well. But yeah, it can be difficult to get emotionally attached to these individuals, and it can be problematic if you have patients die, which almost always that you will have a patient die at some point or other. And you have to think about how you're going to interact with the family in that relationship, right? Because it can be difficult. Any tips for acquiring funding via grants? Yeah, lie a lot. tell them you're going to cure cancer. I mean, if you can find something that has a clinical relevance, you're going to be better served. If you can say this is really going to help advance cancer research, it's going to advance how we treat diabetes, that's going to be more easily funded. I can tell you, I had a lot of difficulty because I was working on the pineal gland and melatonin, and there's no disease of the pineal gland. It's not like people, die from their pineal gland exploding or anything. So it was very difficult for me to get money because I couldn't hang it onto a clinical relevant thing, that this is going to help patients in the future. So if you can find ways that are going to help patients in the future, that will help your funding. And then there are certain areas that get more funding than others. Brain research gets more funding. Cancer research gets more funding. Alcohol, there's a whole institute on alcohol research, so it gets more funding. So there are areas that get more funding if you're willing to go to those areas and do research. But again, you have to decide what you like, what you think is relevant as well. I always tell students you shouldn't go into research and orient your research career based on the funding opportunities, right? You should orient your research career on what you think is important and relevant and is going to advance science, right? But those don't always match, and that can be problematic. I'm interested in the MS in Biomedical Science program. What's its application timeline look like? That's actually on that thing. If you go on the internet, on the link that I have there, you can go check the program out. They usually start looking at applications in the spring, make decisions April and May-ish, and then we have students come in June, and they basically go from June to May. It's a one-year program to get their MS in Biomedical Sciences. It's a good program. I and many of my colleagues teach in it. I think it's valuable because we teach a lot of courses that are kind of medical school level. So if you can do well in those courses, you can feel like you're going to do well in medical school. It's a really nice way to appreciate that. But again, you can go online and look at that up and check it out. You can see the link there. And Nina provides this link as well. We're wrapping up our session. Please hold your questions. Yada, yada. Thank you. Thank you. You're welcome. Thank you. I appreciate it as well. If you're interested in volunteering, happy to help. Okay. Any other questions that people would like to ask, just out front here as opposed to in the chat? I'm told we're winding down. I guess it was supposed to be an hour and a half, and I've gone 6 minutes over.
You're amazing, Dr. Champney. Just by the way, it's so informative. There's so many questions that I have personally, but I just want to be mindful of your time. We definitely can go ahead and have more questions. It's up to you, kind of, though. We just want to be respectful of your time. I personally
very nicely. It's 9:30 in the evening. What am I going to go do? I don't know, watch the news or something and just get upset. So yeah, I don't mind answering more questions if people have some valuable questions they'd like to ask. You can certainly just ask them to me as opposed to writing them in the chat if you'd like. That's fine either way. And as I said, happy to share the PowerPoint if you want to email me, or I know Abraham, I think, has it as well, and he's willing to share it also. So, and happy to just kind of answer questions.
I have a question about colleges. Which would you say like Oxford and Cambridge were good colleges?
Those are really excellent colleges in England, right? They're the top tier colleges in England. This allows me to at least make the comment that I don't think a top tier college is a requirement. All right. You might get just as good an education at a mid-level or even a little lower tiered university, because they might actually give you more time of day. They might give you more input. Some of the top tier educational institutions, they're so worried about getting their research grants and so worried about, being on the top of their field that it can be difficult for them to do good teaching or for them to really be involved with students, et cetera, et cetera. So I went to Southampton College. Southampton College no longer exists. So my undergraduate school is actually no longer exists. I don't get asked for money, which is nice. There's no alumni association that asks me for money, but that university no longer exists. And yet, look, I did okay. Okay. So you don't have to go to a Harvard or a Yale or a Columbia or, some of those. If you can get in, that's great. And they're very good institutions. But sometimes I think they're a little bit overblown, as if you somehow, you're going to get a better education here than you are going to get some other place. And you might actually get just as good an education at another institution. Okay.
I have a question, Doctor. So
Yep.
you've won numerous teaching awards across different institutions. What do you think has contributed most to your success as an educator, and what advice would you offer to those aiming to improve their teaching?
Good question. So yes, I come a family of teachers. So my mother was a high school teacher. My brother was a college professor. My sisters taught high school and elementary school, et cetera. I come from a big family, 4 sisters and a brother. And we're all kind of teachers in one way or another. So I think there's a little genetic component that's involved there as well. So a couple things. You need to know your audience. You need to know who you're talking to, right? So I know that I'm talking basically to high school and undergraduate students here. I'm not talking to 40-year-olds, or I'm not talking to 60-year-olds, right? If I was talking to 60-year-olds, I'd be having a different presentation and a different outlook. So it's very important to, one, know who you're teaching to, the level they're at, what their level of interest is as well. I think it's important when you teach to try to make sure that there is an interest there. You're not just teaching information for information, but you're teaching information that's going to be valuable for the future. And to point that out, oh, this is clinically relevant. You might see a patient like this, or this is valuable. You might see something like that. So I think that is also helpful. You also need to be, what do I want to say? You need to be happy about your teaching. You need to be outgoing about your teaching. The worst thing is somebody to just sit there and reading their slides in kind of a monotone as they go along and along and along. If they're not interested in what they're talking about, if that doesn't excite them, how are you going to be excited about it? How are you going to be interested in it? So you want to, you need to be excited about what you're teaching and think that this is valuable and going to be relevant for the people that you're talking to. And I will tell you that being a teacher is kind of an anti-narcissist. You're actually doing things because you want others to do well. You want others to learn and move on. And that's where you find your reward. The most rewarding thing I can find is if some of you go on and become really good physicians. And as you become good physicians, you say, you know, that Dr. Champney who talked years ago, he really helped me with whatever. That's the reward that I want. That's the value that I see that comes out of that. So you want to be in that position of trying to help people get better, help them to learn, help them to feel that they're going to be better when they've left your, talk or whatever it is than when they came in the talk, and how it goes. So yeah, I really do enjoy teaching. Again, that was kind of one of the decisions when I was at A&M. Remember, I could have gone into become a department head and move into administration. I knew I was going to have to give up some of that teaching and give up some of that research. And I realized I liked the teaching. I really enjoy that aspect of it. And I didn't really want to go into the administrative realm. And so that was another one of the number of factors as to why I decided to leave A&M at that time and go down to St. George's where I could teach, et cetera. Other questions?
What do you think makes a young scientist stand out today? And are there particular skills or mindsets that you believe are essential for a successful academic or research career?
Yeah, so it depends on what your definition of success is. So I felt I was a successful scientist. I published a lot of papers. I made a lot of changes in pineal melatonin that we now know about, right? I pushed the boundaries of science back. But I ran a small lab. It was just me and a couple of folks. I did not run one of these big mega labs that has 50 people in it, et cetera, et cetera. So I was certainly not as successful as some other people. But in some ways, I think running a small, disciplined lab is more successful than running a very large lab where you have lots of things going on and they may not be organized and somebody may be working against somebody else, et cetera, So partly it comes with the definition of success, right? And I think success is, can you make advances in science that are going to be meaningful for science, meaningful for the future, et cetera. If that's the definition of success, then you just find things that you think are valuable and you do the hard but appropriate work to move that forward. You don't cut corners, you don't do things inappropriately, but at the same time, you're not going to get all the accolades and you're not going to win the Nobel Prizes necessarily, and you're not going to, get all that other stuff. But you can go to sleep at night and feel like you've done something valuable, that, you've moved things forward. So, for what it's worth.
Thank you.
Can you be a good doctor if you have a personality disorder? Somebody asked me that. Depends on the personality disorder. There are some doctors who are narcissists, and I do worry about that because they're really in it for themselves, for the money, for the fame, for the glory, etc. They may heal some patients along the way and probably do some very good things, but I don't know that they're the best doctor, right? They can be a good doctor and they can, do reasonable things as they move along, but they may get burned out. They may have other issues that come up. Some of these doctors like that become alcoholics or become drug dependent because they feel like they always have to perform and they always have to be on top of their game, et cetera, et cetera. They're not willing to say that they made a mistake. They're not willing to work as a team to figure out what's the best treatments for individuals, et cetera. In my opinion, the best doctors, this is a fun little story. The Latin term for doctor means teacher. So you can take that and think about that. A really good doctor is a teacher. It's a teacher one-on-one. They're teaching their patients how to be well, how to do things appropriately. And so the best doctors are going to be those that in some ways put the welfare of their patients above kind of their own welfare and what's going on, right? But if you're a narcissist or, a psychopath or some of those things, you probably could be a reasonable doctor. I don't know that you'd be a really good one. So, other questions? If not, I'm going to go to bed.
Thank you so much, Doctor, for being here today. It's so informative. And, I deeply resonated with a lot of what you've said. I'm sure a lot of our students have as well. Again, thank you so much for your time. I'm going to share our closing slides, guys. I know we dropped some people, but there is a quiz up and ready. So after this session, if you guys want to get your hours for shadowing, definitely answer that quiz. Once you pass it, you'll get that certificate. Those hours are yours. Let me share my screen. Okay, so our closing slides. So again, let's reflect on this session. What brought you to the session today? What are 3 major takeaways you got from this presentation?
Abraham, they can't see the screen. They only see that you've started screen sharing.
Oops. Can you guys see it?
Not yet. It just says double click to enter full screen mode or whatever, but it doesn't actually show you.
I apologize. Technical difficulty. Okay. I think Zoom quit unexpectedly.
He's back again.
And I'm back. I'm so sorry. I guess it was Zoom got a little tired too. But essentially, let's real quick send this. I apologize. Okay, can you guys see the screen now?
Not yet. It still says you've started screen sharing. There it comes up.
All right. So sorry, guys. We're almost there. Let's reflect. What brought you to the session today? What are 3 major takeaways you got from this presentation? What do you want to learn more about? And then again, if you are interested in pre-health shadowing, definitely, look at our website, look at our socials. It's our honor to kind of serve you. Again, this is 100% remote. It's a 100% volunteer run. And if you guys want, you can even submit kind of your thoughts on the session today. Don't be shy. We would love to read them. We would even post them on our website as well. And if you can donate, this is a nonprofit. And if you know someone who can, that'll be even better. And then again, after this presentation, you guys can also do the quiz. You'll get your hours. And if you miss the session, remember it will be uploaded on YouTube. Be sure to catch our sessions every week. We're going to have a couple more set out for the remainder of this fall and winter. But yeah, thank you so much for being here, you guys. Again, Dr. Champney, you are awesome. You're so inspiring. And thank you for all the wonderful work that you do in the world and the goodness you provide. Thank you guys for being here today. You guys have a wonderful night.
Thank you all.
Thank you again, Doctor.